Hello again, friends. Thank you for joining me as we continue to study Romans chapter 8. And this afternoon, we want to look at Romans chapter 8, verse 18 through to verse 27. Now, in this passage, Paul speaks about two things. He speaks about the sufferings of the present time, the creation itself groaning and subjected to futility or frustration. He speaks about the inner groaning that we ourselves experience as God's children living in a fallen world. And he speaks about the groaning of the Holy Spirit, who assists us in our prayers with groanings that are too deep for words, verse 26. So in this passage, Paul acknowledges the reality of the fallenness of our world and the brokenness of our world. And of course, we've been reminded of that brokenness and fallenness so much over these last few weeks and months as the world has come to terms with the COVID-19 infection and all the social and financial and personal health impact of that, just the terrible impact that it's had on communities and on people's lives. So, in a sense, we don't need Paul to tell us that the world is groaning and struggling and battling, because we see it every day. And not just in moments of major crisis like the one we're facing at the moment, but really day by day in everyday life. We are very, very conscious of the fact that creation is bound up to what Paul calls futility or vanity, frustration. What is very striking in this passage, though, is that Paul not only acknowledges the fallenness of our present world and its groaning and its struggles, but he also recognizes that the reason our world is in the state it is because of God's judgment and also as part of God's plan. Now that may seem a strange thing to say, but listen to what Paul says in verse 20. He says, creation was subjected to futility. Now he could have been talking about Adam's sin, but I think he's actually talking about the judgment that comes from Adam's sin, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Now look at that phrase, him who subjected it in hope. In the Garden of Eden, God forbade the man and the woman access to the tree of life once they had sinned, once they had rebelled against him. And although it cuts us off from life, at the same time, it is actually a measure of God's grace, because to be sinful and to eat from the tree of life and live forever is really, I suppose, the Garden of Eden equivalent of hell, of being cut off from righteousness and yet living forever. So the entrance of death and of suffering and trials and tribulations into our world, though it is part of the consequence of human sin, and though it is part of the judgment of God, is also part of God's longer-term plan for salvation. And so Paul says that God subjected this creation to futility in hope. And what is the hope? Well, verse 21. The hope is that creation itself will eventually be set free. So from the very beginning, from the judgment that came because of Adam's sin, God already had in mind, and indeed even before that sin, God had in mind a new world, a new creation, in which this present world will be set free from its groaning and its bondage to corruption, and it would enter into what Paul calls the freedom of the children of God, the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So as we are raised from the dead, and we saw that the Spirit guarantees that, because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, so also, says Paul, creation itself will be given a new start, a fresh start, because of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that's what gives us hope in the midst of our present trials. In verse 19, verse 18 rather, Paul says that the sufferings of the present time are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. So Paul is saying, real though the sufferings of these days are, there's a glory that's coming, a new world that's coming, that is far greater than anything we can imagine, and far greater than any of the sufferings that we have endured. Far more glorious. So if you look at suffering on the one hand and glory on the other, well then the glory that is to come far outweighs all the suffering of the present age. And that's a great encouragement to know that, because the sufferings of this present age are often real and painful and deeply distressing. So Paul says that creation itself has been groaning and waiting. And in the midst of this fallen creation, verse 23, we ourselves groan. And even we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even those of us who are Christians, still groan inwardly because we are waiting for that day when our adoption as God's sons and the redemption of our bodies will be complete. So we're looking forward to our inheritance. And although we live with patience in this world, as we'll see in a moment, we live with this hope and this expectation, this longing for the world to come. We want our bodies to be redeemed from sickness and from death. We want our hearts and our inner person to be redeemed from the power of sin. We want to be those new people raised from the dead and enabled to live without sin for God forever. And so right now we live with hope and with patience, says Paul in verse 24. In hope we are saved, and hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? In other words, Paul is saying we haven't yet seen the glory that is to come. This is not as good as it gets, thank God, because as we look around, we see how broken and fallen our world is. No, this is not as good as it gets. There's no heaven on earth. The new creation, the new world is yet to come. And so we live with hope. And because of that, we also live with patience. And I love what verse 26 and 27 tell us. For what we are told is that as we struggle to live day by day with hope and patience and perseverance, the Spirit of God helps us in our weakness. We do not know what to pray as we ought. I mean, haven't you experienced that already? It's so hard to know what to pray for in these days. And it's so easy for us to actually lose our focus on God's great plan and purpose. And really to find ourselves perhaps praying for a person that we know who's struggling or suffering, but not really knowing how to pray about God's big plan and God's big purpose in all of the things that are happening. So what does Paul say? He tells us that even when we don't know what to pray, in the midst of grief or loss or struggling or trial or tribulation, when we just go on our knees and groan, as it were, before God, the Holy Spirit, who knows the will of God, is praying for us, interceding for the saints, according to God's will. Isn't that an encouraging truth? That when you and I don't know what to pray, the Holy Spirit is praying for us and enabling us to continue to live with hope and with patience as we wait for the world to come. Now, tomorrow, Friday, we're going to look at the great passage from verse 28 about God's purposes and all things working out according to God's purposes for the good of those who love Him, and the great truths that we find at the end of Romans chapter 8. That's tomorrow. Thank you for joining me today. God bless you, and we'll see you again.